This is the April 9th meeting, 2024 for SBE Chapter 37, which is the Washington, D.C. chapter. We have our guest tonight, Patrick Cross from Brooks Pierce, who's going to give us an SBE law update. Well, I'm going to give it over to Patrick, and Patrick, thanks again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I mean, it's an honor to represent SBE and more generally, my sort of day-to-day practice, the vast majority of it is working with folks like y'all to deal with, broadcast auxiliary licensing, Earth Station, S&G trucks, closed captioning goes out, what's going on with the equipment, EAS, we missed a test, what do we do? It's kind of that's sort of my area in the firm that I work at, is sort of dealing with more of the technical stuff. So I really appreciate all the work that you all put in to make all the broadcast operations work. So with that, I'll give you all a sort of a high level sort of description first of where I sort of see us standing with the current commission. Last time that we spoke around this time last year, we were still at a 2-2 split among the FCC commissioners. We did not yet have a fifth FCC commissioner appointed. And sort of my stock line back then was, I was surprised it had taken that long, but it wasn't really necessarily a bad thing because it meant that the commission really couldn't act on any of Chair Rosenworcel's sort of hot priorities, which includes for our purposes especially, going after and trying to repurpose broadcast spectrum for new 5G and future 6G deployments. Unfortunately, to a large extent, that has now changed. And so we have a final fifth commissioner here, Commissioner Gomez, Anna Gomez, who was appointed in September of 2023 and confirmed. And so we now have a 3-2 commission split. And we've really seen since that point, Chair Rosenworcel sort of really pursuing her regulatory agenda. And thankfully, we've had it expressed in a few areas that I'll get into here with broadcast auxiliary spectrum that are of concern to us here in the industry. But for the most part, it's really been sort of internet focused. I'm sure we've all seen, net neutrality, the big report and order is about to come out on that. You've had the readoption of EEO Form 395B, which is not anything, hopefully, that anyone on this call has to worry about. But for your ownership, it's a very real burden that's all of a sudden been reimposed here after about a 20-year hiatus. So that's kind of where we are. I had the opportunity to listen to the fifth commissioner, Anna Gomez, speak recently in Washington, D.C. as part of the state leadership conference. And she was very nice and very eloquent. She has, technical experience at the FCC. She worked at the NTIA for a long time. She was chair of the International Bureau, for goodness sakes. But really at her talk, she didn't focus too much on broadcast issues and really was kind of forthright in saying, this is an area where I need to have a better understanding. I need to sort of know more about the broadcast industry, how it works, what's important to you all, and sort of where the lines are drawn. So, if you wanted to take a glass half empty look at that, I think you could say, that's kind of problematic because she's just going to go with whatever Chair Rosenworcel wants, which we've seen with Form 395B and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if you take sort of a longer term view, and we've got an election coming up here that could change things in terms of the current commissioner makeup at the FCC. I like to think of it as a potential to be able to communicate to her about the sort of the vital public interest service that the broadcaster industry provides, to talk about why we still need access to all that broadcast auxiliary spectrum and why we still need to be able to go out and do mobile news gathering and all those sorts of things. So I preface sort of the nitty gritty that I'll get into here with that high level look at sort of what we're facing at the commission right now. But so to quickly kind of pivot away from that over to one of the bigger sort of regulatory and legislative issues that we are monitoring on the SBE front is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA's National Spectrum Strategy. Back in, I believe it was September 2023, maybe November 2023. NTIA sort of solicited comments. Hey, we want to put together a national spectrum strategy. And listed a whole bunch of folks that they wanted to hear from that, had interest in spectrum issues. Notably absent from that list was broadcasters. So SBE got together and filed comments to NTIA saying, hey, raising our hand, we can help you, work through the engineering components of what's necessary for broadcast operations. We're important stakeholders in the spectrum game as well. And so, we need to be sort of part of this conversation that y'all are going to have. Since that time, in March 2024, NTIA released an actual plan that is sort of designed to ensure a spectrum pipeline well into the future for the United States, generally speaking. And so that ranges from all the different stakeholders who need access to spectrum for all sorts of different reasons, including broadcast. The good news as of right now is that broadcast is not part of the particular bands. There are some bands of mid-band spectrum and some upper mid and some upper spectrum as well that NTIA has identified, but broadcast operation spectrum is not part of what is currently part of that plan. Nonetheless, because of sort of the breadth of the ask here with NTIA looking to sort of coordinate with the FCC on a going forward basis for ensuring a pipeline of spectrum well into the future, they have sort of tagged as part of the aspect of the implementation of the plan, the need to identify additional bands for study and potential repurposing. So I say all of this to put it on your radar as something that is out there, that is currently occurring. Thankfully, broadcast spectrum is not under current threat, but it's something that we're monitoring closely because SBE is, ready, willing, and able to put comments into the proceeding if necessary and try and help engage in dialogue on this if broadcast spectrum does become a target on into the future. We've also been working with NAB on that front, and so that's something that'll remain on our radar. Something to transition back to the FCC that I got to throw in because it was such a recent action item and something that may or may not be useful for you all who work with FM stations on a regular basis. The FCC has finally, after 3 years of a pending proceeding, taken action on the zone casting ask by Geo Broadcast Solutions. And that's the also known as the FM translator geo-targeting proceeding. Basically, what the ask from this company, Geo Broadcast Solutions, was for the FCC to modify the rules that they have in place for FM booster stations. And so this only applies to that specific class of FM translator, the FM booster station that's going to be tied to a primary FM facility. And booster stations historically have been used to fill in coverage gaps, right? And that, it stays fully within the contour of the primary FM station and is sort of a way to deal with terrain and other sort of issues to ensure that the signal gets out to the full pop coverage that the FM primary should have. But so basically what Geo Broadcast Solutions asked for and what the FCC has now granted is the ability for FM booster stations to originate programming for up to 3 minutes for each broadcast hour. And so as a practical matter, what this means is that broadcasters can now, as soon as the rules take effect at least, seek experimental authority to be able to do that. There aren't actually formal sort of licensing rules and regs that have been put into place yet. The FCC has sort of tacked on another ask to the proceeding, looking for comments on how can we do that in the future? What kind of licensing regime do we want to have? What should we do about interference concerns, so on and so forth. But at least for right now, the FCC has allowed, once the rules go into effect, again, current FM booster station licensees to be able to originate programming for up to 3 minutes for each broadcast hour. This was a proceeding. I don't want to get too far down in the weeds for you all, but this was a proceeding that really kind of divided the broadcast industry. You had NAB and a bunch of large ownership groups advocating strongly against the adoption of this technology, saying, it sounds all well and good, to be able to originate programming and to be able to sort of particularize it to a greater degree to a specific community in your signal contour. But what if you're crossing over from the primary signal to the booster and there's an EAS alert that goes out? And then all of a sudden, when you switch over, the EAS alert drops. And, what if there's self-interference and you're stuck in traffic? Between the two signals, the booster and the primary interfere with each other, and then all of a sudden you're stuck at sort of that crossover point in traffic for 15, 20 minutes, just as a dead stop standstill. People are going to tune away from the FM dial and away from from the broadcast operations during that time. On the other side of the aisle, there were broadcasters and special interest groups saying, well, no, look, this is a great way to sort of create revenue, to be able to have advertisers come in and specifically target communities. You can use it to sell better advertising. You can better particularize content. You can do special, localized programming for those areas. That there are valid arguments on both sides. And so we see ourselves in a situation now where the FCC has said, on balance, we're going to look for this for experimental authorization for now. And then in the future, we're going to look towards actual, firm licensing requirements for that. If anyone has any particular questions about that or about any other aspect of this, I'm happy to answer those questions. There are various, sort of limits that the FCC has proposed and would tee up as part of the licensing process, including a limit on the number of boosters at 25 that a FM primary station could have. But I'll leave it there for now, just so you all are aware that is something that's out there. And once the rules take effect, you may be called into service to try and figure out how to get some booster stations online to originate some programming. And probably need to deploy their own EAS equipment as well to avoid the issues I discussed. But so to move on from that, another proceeding where we've seen a lot of action and where there's a current comment window opening is in the 6 gigahertz band. This has been a proceeding that's been going on for a while now. In November of last year, the FCC released a set of decisions in the 6 gigahertz proceeding. In particular, SBE, NAB, and IBAS had been successful in going to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals when the FCC adopted their original order that sort of opened up the 6 gigahertz band to unlicensed deployments and very low power operations. And the SBE and NAB and others had successfully gone to the DC Circuit and said, look, the FCC didn't consider sort of all the experience we had in the 2 gig band and all the interference that we experienced there. So all the interference protection sort of procedures and frequency coordination, automated frequency coordination aspects that the FCC is proposing, we discussed that directly in the comments. It's just like 2 gig. We don't want 2 gig again. So they need to reconsider that. And they need to reserve a portion of the band for ENG operations. Unfortunately, even though we wanted the DC Circuit, the FCC ultimately went back and looked at the record, said, nah, we did consider all that, and we don't think that it's necessary to reserve any portion of the band for broadcast operations. So we're just going to open it up based on AFC systems and all the sort of licensing rules that we're going to put in place. Sort of the more sort of relevant component for now is that they have an open comment window on whether or not to expand the types of VLP unlicensed devices that would be operable on the band. The opening comments, followed sort of predictable lines, as you can imagine. NAB and Sirius XM Radio and others opposed the proposal for the broadcast industry. The wireless interests are super excited about it. Apple, Consumer Technology, Wi-Fi Alliance, all of them are, in favor of it. And so basically we're in a position now where SBE is considering whether or not to weigh in on this proceeding. And I expect that we'll discuss that here coming up at NAB. You all may have seen, and if you haven't, then I'll commend it to you right now, that a recent alert went out from SBE to please notify a specific SBE email address if you have experienced interference to your electronic news gathering operations in the 6 gig band over the past several months. The ask there is to report that no later than April 17th, if at all possible. It would be useful for us to have that data so that we can throw it into the record with the FCC if we end up submitting comms in that proceeding. But so that's where we are right now on that. in terms of the current steps on the proceeding, the automated frequency coordination aspect has finally gone through OET, Office of Engineering Technology approval at the FCC. And so after different filings and back and forth and sort of tests of the AFC system for deployment in the 6 gig band, OET has now authorized multiple AFC systems to be deployed. So you will be seeing more 6 gig deployments over the coming months. So just be aware of that. The next proceeding that I wanted to flag for you all is the proceeding in the 13 gig band, 12.7 to 13.25. Really, there hasn't been much action there. That you may recall the FCC initially, opened that proceeding, looking to see if it would be, sort of ripe for repurposing for 5G and 6G deployments. I think the FCC really, frankly, expected just a big win there and Wi-Fi interest to come in and say, yeah, you bet, this sounds great. Interestingly, a lot of the comments that were filed from the wireless providers said, sure, if you want to let us use it, that sounds great. But really what we want is mid-band. You go lower. You got to go lower. This is really not going to do everything that we need it to do for 5G and 6G deployments. And at the same time, of course, SBE filed comments in this proceeding along with NAB and others opposing sort of repurposing and taking away more of our spectrum, core, STL and TSL territory, was a big part of the comment strategy there of sort of like, look, this is without those, there is no broadcast distribution. We're not getting to the transmit sites. What are we going to do? I'll get off my soapbox on that. But at the same time that you had those two sort of sets of comments filed, you had the satellite operators coming in as well and DirecTV saying, please, don't do this because it doesn't seem like it's going to affect us, but it is. It's going to cause interference to our operations in the lower 12 gig. So really comments were pretty heavily split in the proceeding, even among the Wi-Fi folks who I think FCC anticipated would really be in favor of it. So long story short, it's sort of, we're in a holding pattern on that proceeding. There's been no FCC action. I don't know how long it'll take for them to act on that, if at all. Most recently broadcasters filed certifications for all their, 13 gig authorizations that everything is operating as authorized. That was back in November. SBE put out multiple blasts about that. So hopefully you all did that. And to the extent any action comes from that proceeding, those certifications, if timely filed, should preserve your right to interference protection and your reimbursement if the FCC ends up asking for broadcasters to be relocated to another band altogether. The next sort of main action item or sort of area that has seen a lot of FCC action that I wanted to flag for you all is in the emergency alert system space. You ask me as cynical broadcast attorney, I think that one of the reasons you are seeing a lot of action there and you saw this even when the FCC was split 2-2, is because it's a pretty easy area for the FCC to generate consensus. Nobody's really going to look to oppose EAS improvements or, changes to the EAS. That said, there are some sort of definite, obligation upticks that could be coming down the pike here as a result of the FCC's rulemakings. The most sort of recent one is an FCC proposal to require broadcasters to participate in the Disaster Information Reporting System, DIRS. That system's been around since the wake of Hurricane Katrina. It was generated as something that's voluntary for broadcast right now, and is sort of, was designed to give the FCC and others in the federal government quick insight into the operational status of communications infrastructure in a particular disaster area. Earlier in the same proceeding, NAB had weighed in on the potential for broadcasters to be required to log into DIRS, and sort of made the point that, look, when a disaster hits, we are focusing all of our resources on staying on the air, informing the community, And, for smaller broadcasters, if they go dark, how are they going to log in and let you know anything? It's already a struggle enough to, have these folks log in and try and figure out how to navigate the online public inspection file. You want them to go into a whole other FCC system when they don't have power at the studio and figure out a way to notify you. That's just not reasonable or a good use of the limited resources broadcasters are deploying when emergencies hit. We'll see how that shakes out. Comments, the first round of comments haven't been filed yet. They'll be due on April 29th. It'll be interesting to see how that proceeding shakes out. The FCC seems like they want to impose the requirement. I think they want to be able to have quick insight into disaster areas at the end of the day. And so I think unless there are some really strong comments from NAB and others in the broadcast industry, we're likely to see that obligation at some point down the line. The other sort of aspects of the EAS that the FCC has been focused on recently are trying to, number one, enable multilingual EAS alerts, and number two, to potentially adopt a new alert code for missing and endangered persons, an MEP code. I am on the State Emergency Communication Committee in my particular state in North Carolina. And so I could get way down in the weeds on this with you all. I will spare you the drudgery, but just, I guess, be aware that currently pending are both of those proposals. For the multilingual alert rulemaking, the FCC has specifically sort of proposed adopting pre-scripted template alert messages that would be available in the 13 most commonly spoken non-English languages in the United States. So the idea right now, at least as it's presented in the rulemaking, is not that you all would have to generate the content, but instead that you would sort of have, and really that it wouldn't even be on y'all to make this happen. The EAS equipment manufacturers would program this in to your EAS boxes. Sort of like, okay, we've got a severe thunderstorm warning. Okay, we want to broadcast that in Spanish. The equipment handles it all on its own and it goes out. But that's something that's being considered by the FCC. The missing and endangered person alert code is meant to sort of fill the gap between Amber alerts and all the other missing person, alerts that go out. Amber alerts are targeted to basically those who are 17 and younger. And so what missing and endangered person would do would be expand that range to make it so that you would have an alert code that's especially keyed to anyone who's abducted or who we have some sort of issue locating, who doesn't fall for the Amber Alert criteria, and so could be above. So it could be senior citizens, right? Could be, someone, a middle-aged, man or woman who, something happened and they never came home from work one day. That's the idea behind that new alert code, and we will see how that shakes out. The final aspect of the EAS action that's occurring at the FCC that I continue to flag just because it worries me to a certain extent is the FCC's sort of long pending, I think it was in late 2022 at this point, that the FCC proposed sort of requiring stations to adopt a cybersecurity plan for not just for sort of their EAS, but just sort of for the broadcast infrastructure across the board at their station. NAB and others, successfully, filed, or not successfully, but I think persuasively filed comments in the docket that said, look, that's going to be really, really hard for, small stations to implement something like that, to, deal with two-factor authentication, like getting rid of equipment at end of life cycle and having to deal with all that. Sort of more concerning to me as your fellow broadcast attorney here is that they had proposed removing the current ability for a station to operate without operational EAS equipment for up to 60 days without having to ask the Commission for authority to do so while you get it fixed. Instead, what the proposal in that rulemaking is that you would have to report and ask for authority to continue to operate without operational EAS equipment within 24 hours of your EAS equipment going down. And I just that to me is a drastic sea change from the environment we live in right now. And of course, the alarm bell that rings in the back of my mind immediately is this is just ripe for fine potential. Right? You have some software update that bricks your EAS box, and you're so focused on that you forget to notify the FCC, and then all of a sudden you're looking at, a $6,000 fine. We'll see NAB advocated against that as well in the proceeding. We'll see whether or not that ends up being adopted or not. So now to transition back to my FM folks, the FCC is currently considering still whether or not to authorize increased FM digital power output as sort of like a baseline level for folks to license at. The FCC was really, really close, it seemed, to adopting the current proposal that was, NAB, NPR, and XBE put this proposal before the FCC, said, look, we've had, almost 20 years of digital FM broadcasting at this point. We've had experience with it now. We've had experience getting to see what the interference looks like vis-a-vis other digital stations, vis-a-vis existing analog stations. And the formula that we use to calculate maximum permissible power levels for digital FM broadcasters, it's just too low. We just, we played it cautiously. That was the way to do it when it was a new technology, but it's not new anymore. And so we need to spur FM digital deployments, both from the consumer base and the broadcast industry. And so that's the ask. The FCC was close, it seemed, to adopting it. However, NAB and XBE, to their credit, filed, a supplemental comment in front of the FCC that said, really, as we were looking at it, we've really only looked at sort of the standard hybrid mode of digital operation. We haven't looked at extended hybrid modes of operation. And so we need to bake that into the rule. We need to make sure that those power levels are accounted for as well. So there's a supplemental comment window that's happening right now with comments due April 1st and replies due by April 15th. I don't expect that there's going to be much sort of disagreement regarding that. I think it makes sense to account for, all different modes of digital operation and whatever rules get adopted. But it does kick the can sort of a little bit further down the road as the FCC has to take those comments in before they can take action. Moving to my TV folks, the Low Power Protection Act was adopted by the FCC in late December 2023. And so that is going to give LPTV stations in various markets the ability to try and convert to Class A status. Of course, as y'all know, the benefit of Class A status primarily is that you will then be afforded interference protection, whereas LPTV stations as a secondary service are not afforded interference protection from being displaced. So that's the benefit there. It applies to a very sort of small subset. It's only for stations who are operating in DMAs with 95,000 television households or less as of January 5th, 2023. There are a lot of other sort of, nuances and rules to that. But just be aware that that's something you all may be called into service for is to evaluate that for various folks who think that they might have a shot at transitioning from LPTV to Class A service. Other than that, the main sort of core sort of spectrum issue that I wanted to flag for you all is the recent authorization by the FCC of wireless multi-channel audio systems, WMAS. That was a report and order that the FCC issued in February 2024. And it's going to permit WMAS to operate in the TV bands and other Part 74 low power auxiliary station bands. SBE, NAB, and others had filed comments in the proceedings saying, look, we don't oppose WMAS per se. We just want to make sure that you don't think of this as a whole scale substitute for narrowband microphones. We need to keep those around. We need to be able to continue to deploy those. And so we don't want WMAS to sort of be considered a full scale substitute for that. The other sort of concern that went along with those comments that we filed were that, authorizing WMAS could potentially increase interference issues with existing narrowband microphone users, giving the maximum bandwidth that you're looking at with WMAS, since they take up a whole or can take up a whole 6 megahertz channel. So that's kind of where we stood with the proceeding. The FCC ultimately said, okay, yeah, we hear you. There are interference remediation procedures though. And if anything comes up, we can sort of address that going on a going forward basis. But we're going to go ahead and authorize the technology. We want to get it out, want to see how it does out there in the field. So that's what we're looking at now. That was authorized or the report and order was adopted in February 2024, rather. So that's another area where just be aware that is starting to be deployed here in the not too distant future. And so just keep an eye out for that and for any interference potential there. The final sort of spectrum issue here, interestingly enough, is the fact that the FCC still actually doesn't have the ability to auction off spectrum. We're past a year now since the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority expired. And that's really kind of unprecedented. And so frankly, I'm a little speechless here. I should have thought more about what I was going to say about it, other than I don't I don't know what to tell y'all. There is no way for the FCC to auction off spectrum right now. There's a bill pending in the Senate, introduced by Senator Cruz and Senator Thune, called the Spectrum Pipeline Act, that would reinstate Spectrum Auction Authority, but it would also require identifying at least 2,500 megahertz of mid-band spectrum that could be reallocated. So yeah, it could potentially go through. Senator Cantwell from Washington also is supposed to have a proposal to reauthorize the FCC's auction authority. But for right now, the FCC is just sort of actively, seeking input from stakeholders about, hey, what can we do? Since we don't have the ability to auction off spectrum, how can we sort of make sure that, new licensees can come into the ecosystem and that we can sort of be able to utilize spectrum at its highest and best use? We'll see where that goes. The final two sort of things I'll flag for you here are less spectrum and more sort of on the monetary front. The first is that I think we're going to see a substantial increase in annual Earth Station regulatory fees. Basically, as y'all may recall, the FCC split the International Bureau up last year and created a new Space Bureau. And so basically the International Bureau was sort of, subsumed by the Space Bureau. And the Space Bureau also got a whole other section to it as well. So what the FCC has now basically said is, look, there are a lot more members of the FCC who are staffed in the Space Bureau. So we got to collect more fees to be able to pay for them. And also, we think that more of the Space Bureau's time is spent to, dealing with Earth Station licenses than we have anticipated in past years. So I think you're looking at, for anybody with an S&G truck out there, with anybody who's got a bunch of, C-band receives on your roof to get programming, there could be a substantial increase in the fees that we're paying every year to be able to use that spectrum and use those dishes. So just be aware that that's something that's happening out there that you may see take effect in the coming year. And the final one is, I guess, appropriate since I just mentioned C-band, but we've got the final sort of reimbursement deadline coming for anybody who has remaining sort of relocation issues to be worked out for their C-band dishes. I expect this affects few, if any of you, but for any claims that have arisen regarding your C-band dishes that occurred after December 31st, 2023, you have to submit those by July 1st, 2024. I think of all the folks that I work with, I can think of one person who's still dealing with reimbursement issues on C-band, and that's sort of a one-off circumstance where you had a bunch of received dishes at a sort of remote location that for various different reasons didn't fall into sort of the normal sort of turnkey sort of filter install, repoint the dish process, and so we're still working through that. But again, I expect that will not affect most of you all, but just do be aware that deadline is out there. Other than that, that's what I have for you all. There are a couple things that I kind of just skipped over here in my discretion on my report because this has winded on long enough for one lawyer to be just speaking at all of y'all. But I'm happy to talk and answer any questions if you have any.
So I actually do have one. One of the things you mentioned was the FCC considering HD power increases.
Yep.
In particular, I was wondering if there had been any more discussion about how that would affect stations that are superpowers.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So that is part of the comment window that was opened. And so I'm not sure if that will come up in the current sort of supplemental comment window, because that really is just kind of targeted to the modes of operation and not so much the superpowers. But I mean, in the last comment window that they had prior to this one that just got open, superpowers were part of the discussion, sort of the whether or not, different interference remediation procedures should apply, digital versus digital as compared to digital versus analog. They sort of got into all those technical issues. But I don't have any sort of prediction on how that will ultimately be resolved.
This is a question that maybe uh, Patrick can answer, maybe not, and it has to do with LPFM stations. One of the guys out on the West Coast here did a national survey and discovered something like 30% of the LPFM stations have coordinates that are 200 feet or more away from where they're authorized. And the question I asked is, where in the FCC rules does it give the uh, amount of space that you can be off that you could tell the LPFMs there's the citation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Barry, and that does not surprise me to hear that about our LPFM friends. So I will tell you that I have never looked at the rule for LPFM stations before. Typically, and I'm gonna analogize here because I know for full service and I know for LPTV in particular and TV translators that the typical measurement is can be up to 5 seconds. I think in LPTV it's actually 3 seconds variance, and that's lat and long. So lat can be off by up to 3, and long can be off by up to 3. So my guess, Barry, is that the LPFM rules would be the same. I don't see any reason why the FCC would have deviated from that. But I don't have an actual rule site for you on that.
Well, what was told to me was because of the low power aspect, it's only 60 feet that they allow, and not a number of
Mm.
seconds even, but 60 feet. And I I just don't know for sure.
Well,
Yeah, no,
60 feet is I'm sorry, 1 second is about 80 feet.
right. That's interesting. Yeah, so I'm gonna see if I can sort of crack the code on this live. But please continue to
Yeah,
talk
Barry,
or
I did.
ask other questions. They'll take me a sec.
The other thing that I learned in this whole business was that at least the LPFMs, the commission is now requiring it to be listed in NAD 83. And so all the conversions going from 83 to 27 or Google Maps to whatever, now you have to figure out how to go from decimal to degree minutes seconds.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Did you say that LPTV, especially the translators, need to be within 3 seconds?
I believe it's 3 seconds. Yes.
Well, that's 240 feet. So if
Okay.
LPFM is off by 200 feet, that seems about similar.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I'm assuming I didn't see the original topic when it came out that this is all uh, latitude and longitude and not height.
Yes. Yep. That's correct. Yeah. There's a separate requirement for height that I do not remember off the top of my head, but it's much as you can imagine, much smaller sort of variance. I have 10 feet in my head. That may be completely wrong, but it's much smaller.
And then you also mentioned something about LPTV stations getting a class. I can't remember which class license,
Yep. Class A. Mhm.
class A. And do you remember what the deadline was for those stations to apply for that transition?
Yeah, so that hasn't been opened yet. So the reason behind that is the FCC adopted the rules, but now they got to get the it wouldn't be the federal government if you didn't have to go through a million different steps, right? You have to get the actual form that folks need to use to apply approved through something called the Office of Management and Budget. And so they're going through that process right now.
Thank you very much.
And so what I'm looking at, Barry, on this is the LPFM rule on modification of transmission systems. And I've got, it may even be more strict than you and I imagine. It does specify height, any change in antenna height more than 2 meters above or 4 meters below the authorized value. But as compared to the other rule that I mentioned in full service and LPTV, where it actually spells out geographic coordinate changes that you can make, this says that you have to get a construction permit to make any change in station geographic coordinates, including coordinate corrections and any move of the antenna to another tower structure located at the same coordinates. I'll give you the caution there that with this being a live read, there may be some other rule and reg out there, Barry, that ties into this. It may also be that the actual report and order that adopted this rule has some further gloss on this. But with those caveats in there as sort of like a use at your own risk, that rule is 73.875. And specifically B2 is what I'm looking at.
Thank you. But it doesn't show distance off the coordinates.
Yeah, exactly. Which is what's so odd to me, because it does in the other versions of the rule for the other broadcast services.
It must be a policy.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That looks like a Cheshire cat kind of grin there. I will take Barry's. The policies can be helpful and can be harmful sometimes. I'll just throw in just for Barry's further reference, 74.751 is the LPTV rule, specifically subsection C. And that's the difference there that I was just talking about. It says a station may file a correction of geographic coordinates where the change is 3 seconds or fewer in latitude and or 3 seconds or fewer in longitude. Blah blah blah. There's some other caveats, but yeah. So that's how I usually read that rule. And I just haven't come across the LPFM one before.
Great. Thank you very much. Patrick, I really want to thank you for making time in your schedule to do the presentation for us. I really do appreciate it. And hopefully you or one of your colleagues will be willing to do this again in about 12 months.
Absolutely. Hey, it's our pleasure. Like I said, it's an honor to represent SBE and to get to work with y'all.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.